Imagine walking into a building with no cultural references, no historical influences, no familiar motifs. Would you still find meaning in it? Or would it feel alien, disconnected from the human experience? So we've explored architecture's cultural burdens, the ethics of cultural appropriation, and the radical ideas behind. Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and welcome to Why Buildings Matter, a shortcast series brought to you by the Architecture Hypothesis podcast. This series is designed to be short and digestible, something you can listen to during your free time, at the end of the day, on a train, a bus, or whenever you feel like diving into thought-provoking discussions about architecture. Each episode will explore a key architectural concept and discuss a fascinating book on architectural theory or criticism. So, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 2 of Why Buildings Matter, our shortcast series where we dive deep into fascinating and sometimes controversial topics in architecture. Today we're tackling a subject that's been widely debated, cultural appropriation in architecture. But before we get into that, let's take a moment to talk about architecture itself and the cultural weight it carries. Architecture isn't just about technical know-how. It has always been deeply intertwined with culture. So here's the big question. Can architecture ever be separated from history and society? If we look at thousands of years of architectural evolution, we'll see that the answer isn't so simple. The ancient Roman architect Vitruvius famously stated that architecture is a combination of practice and theory, of material and meaning. But this definition itself raises an exclusive question. What counts as architecture and what doesn't? In other words, how we define architecture is inevitably tied to cultural narratives. Dr. Gulsum Baydar, in her research published in the Journal of Architectural Education, points out that since the colonial period, Western powers have used architecture as a tool of dominance. Non-Western structures were often dismissed as primitive, lacking systematic order, or simply placed on the margins of the global architectural map. Take, for example, The Tree of Architecture by Sir Bannister Fletcher, a historical genealogy of architecture. Non-Western architectural styles were relegated to side branches, while the so-called main trunk of architecture remained exclusively European. If we look at it through a theoretical lens, architecture is never a fixed category. Before something is labeled as architecture, it's just an object. Only when it's given a name does it become a recognized part of architectural discourse. And let's be clear, this naming process is never neutral. Every definition of architecture carries political, cultural, and historical implications. Homi K. Bhabha, one of the leading figures in post-colonial theory, raised important questions about cultural difference and how these differences reinforce power structures. He argued that culture is never static. It's always being shaped by conflict and instability. The same goes for architecture. During the colonial period, architectural diversity didn't just challenge Western theories, it actively disrupted the boundaries that had been set. Interestingly, many non-Western cultures attempted to legitimize their own architectural traditions by aligning with Western standards. Take the Ottoman Empire, for instance. They developed architectural classifications to parallel the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders of ancient Greece. But ironically, this only reinforced the division between the self and the other. By adopting foreign standards, these cultures risked losing their own agency, caught in a precarious relationship between East and West. So, is there a way to free architecture from this cultural burden? Maybe if we stop imposing Western or Japanese standards and instead embrace a more pluralistic approach, we can see architecture in a broader, more inclusive way. After all, architecture isn't just a static object. It's an ongoing negotiation between power, history, and identity. And who knows, instead of being trapped in layers of imposed meanings, maybe architecture can become an open space, one where people create their own interpretations and experiences. We've talked about architecture and its cultural burdens, but if we're discussing culture and architecture, we can't ignore another hotly debated topic: cultural appropriation. So, what exactly is cultural appropriation in architecture? And is it really a problem? Since the dawn of civilization, architecture has been a constant dialogue between cultures. Styles have always borrowed from and influenced one another. For example, the covered walkways seen in Western universities can be traced back to Christian monasteries, which themselves were influenced by ancient Roman courtyards, which in turn were inspired by Greek architecture. If you look closely, the history of architecture is essentially a story of adaptation and innovation. But in today's world, where cultural appropriation is a growing concern, people have started asking tough questions. At what point does architectural borrowing cross the line? When does it shift from appreciation to exploitation? From homage to plagiarism? And if cultural influences become subject to legal restrictions, what would that mean for the future of architecture? This might sound extreme, but it's not entirely unfounded. Think about how a major fashion brand might release a jacket inspired by African culture, only for it to turn out to be a direct copy of a traditional Romanian garment. When that happens, public outrage is understandable. But does the same logic apply to architecture? A building isn't just a commercial product. It exists within a social, cultural, and historical context. Take the Jean-Marie Tjibaou Cultural Center in New Caledonia, designed by architect Renzo Piano. It blends traditional Kanak architecture with modern construction techniques. Is this cultural appropriation, or is it a respectful fusion of tradition and innovation? If we become too rigid in policing cultural borrowing in architecture, we risk losing some of the world's most iconic structures. Western theaters still carry echoes of ancient Greek temples, and Asian townhouses reflect both Chinese and colonial influences. Cultural exchange isn't just a trend, it's the very foundation of architectural evolution. So the real question isn't, should we borrow from other cultures? It's, how do we do it responsibly? A good architect can draw inspiration from a foreign culture, but they need to understand and respect the origins of the elements they use. The difference between appropriation and appreciation lies in the intent behind the borrowing. And if one day we decide to completely ban cultural borrowing in architecture, the only thing we'll truly lose is our ability to create. So far, we've explored architecture, culture, and cultural appropriation, but modern architectural discourse isn't all about cultural references. There's one school of thought that completely rejects everything we've discussed so far. It's called Non-Referential Architecture. This idea is explored in the book Non-Referential Architecture by Valerio Olgiati and Marcus Breitschmidt, and it makes a bold claim. Architecture doesn't need to reference tradition, context, or external values to be meaningful. Sounds extreme, right? But it's also revolutionary. Olgiati argues that today's world is experiencing a breakdown of shared ideologies, those very ideologies that once shaped global architecture. As a result, architecture must break free from old narratives and create its own meaning. He states, bringing in external themes such as history, economy, or environment limits imagination. Buildings like that become trapped in references. So if we strip away context and history, what's left of architecture? Olgiati answers this with 7 core principles. Experience of space. Architecture is about spatial experience, not just aesthetics. Oneness. A building should have a cohesive concept from start to finish. Newness. True architectural innovation isn't about trends, but shifting perceptions. Construction. Architects should integrate design and structure, not separate them. Contradiction. Unconventional elements challenge perception and stimulate curiosity. Order. Architecture should follow its own internal logic, free from old standards. Sense-making. A building must have spiritual and emotional resonance beyond function. It's a fascinating idea, right? but also highly controversial. If architecture doesn't reference history, culture, or context, does it lose its human touch? Can a building that ignores its surroundings truly serve the people who use it? Let's take a look at some examples. A perfect case study of this philosophy is Olgiati's own Yellow House Museum in Flims, Switzerland. At first glance, it's a minimalist white cube. No ornaments, no historical details, no explicit cultural references. And yet, the building still evokes emotions. Its spatial composition, the way light interacts with its surfaces, the materials used, all of these elements create an experience that transcends historical and cultural labels. Another example is Therm Vals by Peter Zumthor. While the design doesn't reference a specific architectural tradition, it evokes something deeply primordial and elemental, as if it has existed forever, untouched by time. So is it truly non-referential, or does it tap into a universal, subconscious reference that exists beyond culture? This is where the debate gets interesting. On one hand, the non-referential architecture movement argues that buildings should exist independently without relying on external narratives. But on the other hand, we as human beings experience architecture through the lens of our own memories, histories, and cultures. Imagine walking into a building with no cultural references, no historical influences, no familiar motifs. Would you still find meaning in it? Or would it feel alien, disconnected from the human experience? So we've explored architecture's cultural burdens, the ethics of cultural appropriation, and the radical ideas behind non-referential architecture. And now I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe architecture should always reference history and culture? Can a building be truly independent from external narratives? And most importantly, how do you experience architecture in your daily life? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. If you enjoyed today's episode of Why Buildings Matter, consider supporting us by buying a coffee. Links to Ko-fi and PayPal are in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode of Why Buildings Matter.